What is up, Flutter devs? I heard from my calendar that apparently quarter one is over, and so it must be time for a quarterly update. For those of you who have been subscribed to the channel and tuning in since at least the very beginning of this year, maybe end of last year, I've decided to start doing these quarterly updates because I treat what I do as a business, so I'm always recalibrating every quarter. I figured why not bring all of you along for the ride so you know what I'm up to, what I've accomplished in the previous quarter, and what I'm expecting to do in the following quarter. We're at the boundary between Q1 and Q2, so here we are having another quarterly update conversation. Now, the last one of these I did was the first one, and so there wasn't really a previous quarter to discuss. But now we actually have a quarter in the books. Q1 2021 is in the books. And so let me start by going through what I did end up getting done in the last quarter. I told you that most of my time was going to be spent on a few contracts, and that did end up being the case. Those of you who tuned in to Flutter Engage, that was, in a world without a pandemic, it would have been probably an in-person conference. Instead, it was one of these online live stream events. I'm sure most of you tuned in, but there was also some ancillary content, things that weren't part of the video event, but they were related to kind of the launch of Flutter 2 and the other announcements. One of those things was 10 Flutter recipes. So recipes are very short guides that kind of show you how to achieve one specific effect or result, what have you. So if you go to the website, if you go to flutter.dev and you go to the docs section, there's actually, I believe, a category called recipes. There were 10 new recipes that were released publicly for Flutter Engage, and I drafted those 10 recipes. I worked with Very Good Ventures. Very Good Ventures was in charge of that project, as well as some other work related to Engage. And three developers, myself and two others, implemented 10 different recipes, and then I came in as the author on the Very Good Ventures side to write those out, and then had members of the Flutter team do the copyright editing on those recipes. So that was one of the contracts that I worked on in Q1. Another one is for an open source rich text editor. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on that right now because we haven't quite gotten to an MVP yet. We haven't gotten to the first public release, let alone a 1.0 release. And there's probably going to be some public marketing presentations about that project in the non too distant future. So I won't go too deep. I won't scoop my own project here that I'm working on with another company. But that company came in and said, hey, we need this for our product, but we also think the community should have a composable, extensible, dependable, rich text editor as well. And I said, I agree. I need something to display blog posts because that's a personal project that I'm working on. I could probably build the editor that you could use for your product and I could use for my blog and the community could use for all rich text editing. And the company said, well, if you can build it, we can pay for it. I said, great. Sounds like a plan to me. So I've worked on that through pretty much all of Q1 off and on. We've made a lot of progress. We're trying to kind of work out the kinks, but I hope to reach at least an initial public release, if not a 1.0 release sometime in Q2. So I'm going to continue working with that company, continue working on the open source project. And again, you should expect some videos and blog posts and other things in the near future as that project gets to a more stable point. The third contract that I worked on was for a company in the mortgage space. I haven't told them that I was going to talk about this, so I won't name them. Maybe in the future, I'll actually bring someone on from the company to do an interview. We'll see how that works out. But I helped them with a couple different apps in their space through Q1. I will continue that work into Q2. And actually, I'll probably have an expanded role in that company in Q2. Those were the contracts. Again, that was the majority of my time. That was the paying work, so that work has to come first. But I told you at the beginning of Q1, I said, look, I want to port processing to Flutter. And I want to port processing to Flutter so that we can incentivize high schools, universities, community colleges, any educational institution possible to use the Flutter version of processing. Because processing is this technology that's already used in a number of educational institutions. For many people, it's their beginning journey into programming. It's beginner, I mean, the tool is sophisticated, but it's beginner programming in the audiovisual space. I would like to get educational institutions to use the Flutter version so that we can get Flutter into educational institutions. And you might say, well, why would they switch? If processing is this mature tool and it's doing the job, why would they change to some new Flutter version of processing? Well, the reason would be that you can do so many other things with Flutter. Processing is really, you can use it for prototypes, you can use it for artistic projects, and of course you can use it to learn the beginning of how to program and how to program audiovisual content. But you're never going to publish an app with processing. You're never going to build an Android app, an iOS app, a web app, a desktop app. You're not going to ship products with processing, but you can ship products with Flutter. So if Flutter can do processing roughly as well as processing does processing, and you can ship apps, the value proposition there is immense. The job market value is immense. And if we can get Flutter into the educational institutions, then we have an automatic hiring pipeline. So in that vein, I produced 16 videos in Q1 on that trek to port processing to Flutter. Hopefully some of you watch those videos. I know Tim, if you're watching, hi Tim. Thanks for tuning in and thanks for letting people know that they exist. I know Tim has been enjoying them. Up to this point, what I've implemented has been pretty straightforward. With some videos coming up, you're going to see, we're going to start to get into a little more complicated territory. I'm going to screw some stuff up. I'm going to confuse myself a little bit. So it'll get a little more interesting, a little more reality TV as we move forward. But again, 16 videos produced for porting processing in Q1. And in those videos, we were able to get all of the 2D drawing primitives ported over. So circles, ovals, I think they're called ellipses in processing. So circles, ellipses, squares, rectangles, arcs, lines, dots, was it? Points, I think. I think that was all the primitive drawing capabilities, but they're all ported. They are available in the Flutter processing package. And all of those painting APIs have associated golden tests, meaning screenshot tests, meaning we actually, in the test, we paint pixels to a file, and every time we run the test, we compare the test to the PNG file. Now the videos, we don't need to have videos for porting processing for that project to have relevance, but I did it because I figured if I'm going to port processing anyway, I want to share with all of you what it actually looks like to work through a project that has, clearly we need to deliver a particular thing within a reasonable time period with API considerations. And so I wanted to demonstrate, like, I think a lot of beginner programmers, those early in their career, there's like this mythical view of the expert programmer. And I'm not suggesting that any of you think that I am, but probably some of you do. And I actually want to dispel that. I think really what sets programmers apart is largely two things. One is the knowledge of a variety of tools to apply to different problems, and the other is a consistency in process. I'm not necessarily hyper technical. I don't have all the different tools that some people have, but I do try to stick to a process. And so, no pun intended. And so what you see as we port processing is that I have a pretty consistent approach to what I'm trying to do and how I'm trying to do it. I don't really have deep knowledge of processing. And while I do have fairly good knowledge of Flutter, when we really get down to the compositor, to the GPU interaction, stuff like that, I don't really know what's going on. But I do have a clear goal, and I have a process that I put into place in every video. And so I'm trying to demonstrate to those of you who have only been around 6 months, a year, 2 years, that there's no magic moment where you become an expert or you know everything or you have superpowers with code. It's just a matter of consistently applying robust processes to how you develop what you develop and asking the question, why? Why am I building this? What are the options available to me? Of these options, which one is the best or which one is at least the least bad? That's the way most of us do what we do. And so that's why the processing videos exist, and they will continue. I also promised you a Flutter challenge in Q1, and I delivered 1 week before the end of Q1. It was for dynamic springs. Initially, that was based on a question from someone, I think on Twitter. I can't remember. There may have been like a Twitter Stack Overflow mix there. But there was a question of, because I had commented on the Flutter project, I had mentioned that there's no way to update a spring simulation. Like, you can create a spring simulation, you can run the simulation, but if halfway through the simulation you want to spring somewhere else, there was nothing in the actual Flutter spring simulation class to do that. And I had mentioned that I had prototyped one. So someone asked in one of those forums, hey, can you do a video about this? Or can you share the code? And so now I have done a video about it. I've shown not only how to update a single dimension of a spring, but how to actually have a 2-dimensional spring that at any moment in time can go from one anchor point to another anchor point and keep springing all over the place. Now, I said that I wanted to look into a podcast. I did reach out to some guests. I did start working on some assets for that, but I didn't make any really good headway on a podcast. I'll talk about Q2 in a moment, but I'm not sure that's going to change in Q2. It's still on my radar. It's still something for me to do, but it doesn't exist yet. I had a number of people set up consultations with me in Q1. So I think I mentioned in my last video at the end of the year or beginning of this year that I now offer 1 hour one-on-one consulting. So if you go to consulting.superdeclarative.com, you can schedule an hour on my calendar. It is a paid service, but you can schedule an hour with me and we can talk through something that you don't understand. I can review your code. We can talk about structural decisions or the direction for a project or how to get started. It's totally up to you. You kind of bring whatever is on your mind. I bring my expertise and we see how I can help you out. But there were a handful of people that set up consultations with me in Q1. I think they all went very well. I would say that probably most of them were aimed at structural questions. I think some people came in looking for state management help, and I pretty quickly explained that state management doesn't exist, and we talked about what the actual problems were that they were facing. So I've been very happy with that. And in fact, one of the people who set up a consultation, we had quite a few consultations throughout Q1, but now I'm actually helping his team with some work on their app because it's an area where I happen to have some expertise. And so those consultations can become something even more useful and more productive than just a consultation as well. I also noticed recently that some of you have been nice enough to drop by and donate to the open source cause and the free video cause. So at donate.superdeclarative.com, that's a web page that I have set up for any of you who appreciate the free videos, the free blog posts, open source contributions. That's a place where you can support me. You can support me with one-time payments or recurring payments if you're feeling really gracious. But I noticed that a few of you did donate recently at the end of Q1, so I want to say thank you for that. Every dollar helps, and I appreciate that you appreciate this work enough to drop by and make a donation. Now that's all Q1 out of the way. Let's talk about Q2. Originally, at the beginning of the year, I was planning to kind of take it easy in Q2. I had some personal projects to go work on. That probably isn't going to happen at the end of the day because 2 of those 3 contracts that I mentioned in Q1 are going to go on into Q2. I'm going to push that rich text editor across the finish line for an MVP, and then I will likely continue on in at least an ad hoc fashion as the technical lead for that project to make sure that the API stays stable and we have good test coverage and, we're keeping it really solid. I'm also going to continue on with that mortgage company that I mentioned and probably expand my role and impact there as well. So that's going to take up a lot of my time. But you will still have the processing videos. I already have a new battery, a new group of processing videos ready to go. So I imagine that you will get at least one, if not two a week through the entirety of Q2. And some of the things we're going to tackle in the upcoming videos, we're going to get animation working. And animation and processing is nothing more than just drawing one frame after another, but that's what allows you to animate. We're also going to get control over the size of the canvas. We're then going to do we're actually going to use processing for a couple UIs, a couple, I don't know what you really call them, a little artistic projects. What I'm going to do, I mentioned this earlier as well in my previous video, but I'm going to take a couple of the coding challenges from the coding train and we're going to recreate them with the Flutter version of processing. So we're going to get a couple of those videos really soon as well. And then we're going to push on into some of the more interesting functionality that processing provides. I will try to do one more Flutter challenge in Q2. I'm not going to promise that this time, but I will do my best to give you another Flutter challenge at some point in Q2. If you have specific requests for that, feel free to post them on Twitter or even in the comments on this video. I do try to read all the YouTube comments and all the Twitter mentions and responses. So if you have something in mind that makes sense for a Flutter challenge, I'm willing to consider it. We'll see what happens. So that's mostly going to be what Q2 is. I will again see what progress I can make, if any, on a podcast, but no promises there because a podcast is a huge amount of work. You have to line up the guests. You have to schedule the shoots. You need to get like half a dozen episodes in the can before you launch the thing because schedules are always chaotic. So it's kind of a big undertaking, and we'll see how it goes. The last thing that I'll mention is that I plan to launch in Q2 a kind of professional practices website for Flutter. I think I may have mentioned this in the video from earlier in the year, but maybe not. I think we have an issue where, and this is not unique to Flutter, this happens with pretty much every technical topic, but we have a noise to signal ratio problem in terms of education and advice. Everybody has an opinion. Whether you go to Medium or Stack Overflow, or there are blogs that aggregate posts from other people. You go to any of these places and you can find 10 different answers to every question. But rarely is it clear why you would use any of those 10 approaches. What makes one of them different or better than the other? What context makes sense for this? Why are we using it? How did you come up with it? Where did it come from? We're losing history. We're losing context. We're losing purpose. And so people are just randomly picking up recommendations from other people and applying them, and they might be a really bad idea. So there's all this noise. It makes it difficult to know what to select, and then when you're selecting it, you don't know why you're selecting it. I want to try to do something to combat this because in the long run, this is really unhealthy. We're going to end up with a world filled with Flutter apps that have totally inconsistent solutions for no reason. But then ironically, some will have consistent solutions when they shouldn't. It's just a big mess. We're going to create a lot of really terrible code, and eventually that's going to make Flutter look bad, even though it's not Flutter's fault. So what this website is going to do is it's going to introduce very specific recommendations for attacking relatively specific problems. I'm going to break it up at least into a few sections. There will be an area on canon, which will kind of be my strong personal recommendations for how to solve common problems. And those will tend to be patterns. They won't necessarily be a specific code solution, but they will say, here's a kind of problem, and here is a kind of solution for that problem, and here's why you would want to use it. But it's not going to be a direct code guide. But then in a different section, there will be guides which say very plainly, okay, here's the goal that you want in Flutter. Here are the exact steps you take to get there. So it's very quickly just get you moving to solve whatever that problem is. And then there will be a blog where I will post not necessarily news, but that will be a place for me to send recurring content. And the difference between recurring content and stable content is really important. The stuff in the canon section, I always want that to be the up-to-date recommendation. I want it to be a very good recommendation, a well-crafted recommendation, and I want it to always be what the recommendation is. I don't want it to be a stream of changes over time. But the blog, that's a place to post ideas, thoughts, questions, occasionally news, that kind of stuff. So I'm going to wrap all of these kinds of content into one professional-oriented website for Flutter developers, for professional Flutter developers. I've already broken ground on this. I've gotten quite a bit of it figured out, and I hope to launch that publicly in Q2. So that's Q1 revisited, and that is the plans for Q2. Feel free to comment below with any questions that you have for me, any recommendations. If you think there's anything I should have my eye on that I don't. But otherwise, I will see you as we port processing to Flutter. I will try to get you a Flutter challenge at some point here in Q2. Maybe a podcast, and then hopefully this professional education website. So with that, welcome to quarter 2. Probably 30 seconds from now, we'll be in quarter 3. Regardless, I'll see you then.